we were thinking about this a few months ago, and we were recognizing that many of the key messages that we've been emphasizing through Minnesota Compass over the past couple of years had to do with different parts of the aging spectrum. So those of you who have seen us present have probably seen this slide before, which talks about the aging of the baby boom and about how those age 65 or older, that age group will more than double over the next 20 or so years. So we've been talking a lot about that as one of our key messages, and how that relates to ratios like this, where there's, for every retirement age person in the state currently, there are about 5 workers currently, but you go out another 20 or so years and that ratio changes to only 3 workers. So again, the aging of the population has been a big key message, something that we've been talking about quite a lot. On the other end of the age spectrum, we've been talking about trends like this one, that Minnesota is becoming much more diverse, and especially among youngest Minnesotans, you see the highest amount of diversity in our state. 29% of those that we call the digital generation, digital natives. I guess we forgot to put that. Are there any digital natives that should have been voting? But that's another of our key messages that we've been talking about, the coming diversity in our state, and how that relates to some of the troubling gaps that we now see as early as 3rd grade here shows a big disparity in the proportion of students of color versus white students meeting state reading standards, for example. So we've been talking a lot about the aging of the population, some things with the younger Minnesotans. And so we were thinking, well, if people have been paying real close attention, they might think that we think that Minnesota just looks like this. Looks good, but that's not all. Maybe the Minnesota just looks like this. But we're here today to remind us all that Minnesota also looks like this. So we'll be taking a look at millennials today, of course, through the lens of Minnesota Compass, focusing on some of the key measures. Many of you have served on advisory committees and have told us, you know, we need to focus on a few things and talk about those few things. And so among our 13 topics that we cover today, we'll be especially focusing on 3 of them: on the economy, especially as that relates to employment, on education, and on civic engagement. And so first we'll be talking about how, I'll be providing some context about what's going on for the state as a whole, but we'll be turning to Jane to dig a little deeper with some analysis that we haven't actually showed to anyone before. So we got some new stuff to show you here today. But to get us into that, we're gonna talk a little bit more, get us a little bit further into that generational thinking. I'll get you to grab those keypads once again and answer this question for me, if you will. What do you think is the state's largest generation? Aha, you guys answered the same way I would have about a month and a half ago. But the actual right answer is, surprisingly, is the millennial generation. And so that, of course, is another reason why it's important to talk about the millennial generation. By just barely, the millennials outnumber baby boomers in our state. There are about 1.5 million millennials in Minnesota compared to about 1.3 or 1.4 baby boomers. Surprising fact. To get us more to think about the demographics of millennials here in Minnesota, how about this question? Keep those keypads handy. About how many of Minnesota's millennials are immigrants? Good guess. The 13% was a good guess, but the actual answer, as you can see there, is 8%. I want to assure you, however, that those of you who did not answer 8%, it's not your fault. You were just I asked the wrong question. Each of these percentages actually have some meaning for today's conversation. So in Minnesota, 8% of millennials are immigrants. That 24%, those of you who answered 24%, the question you were answering were how many of millennials were persons of color, and so about a quarter of the millennial generation is made up of persons of color. Those of you who were answering 13%, you're like me, thinking about the Generation X. That's how many of the Generation X are immigrants here in Minnesota. The 8%, by the way, is not only how many millennials are immigrants or foreign born, It's also for millennials who are in their teenage years. Remember, millennial covers 14 to 30 to 33. The teenagers, we have some data about how many of those are themselves children of immigrants. So another 8% are in that late teenage age range are themselves children of immigrants. So a lot of millennials are touched by the immigrant experience either directly or by virtue of being children of immigrants. And that 4% of all millennials in Minnesota live in St. Louis County. And why is that important? Well, you know, St. Louis County is great, and in reality, it's just a cheap reminder that we have a lot of geographically based information on Compass. We're going to be talking a lot about statewide trends today, but don't forget that we do actually have a lot of county level, regional, and some city level data that's pretty interesting. Okay, so let's turn towards our first topic of the day. Again, I'm going to provide this broad overview, some context about what's going on in Minnesota before turning it over to Jane. So what do we know about education here in Minnesota? Well, we know that we are a highly educated state, that many people think of education as one of our competitive advantages here in the state. Today, about 33% of all adults have a bachelor's degree or a higher education in our state. If you rank us numerically, we rank 10th among all states, and there's really only a handful of states that are statistically higher than Minnesota. But we do have a strong, education is very strong in this sense. By the way, the Twin Cities ranks 5th overall among the 25 largest metro areas in terms of education. So it's very important to our state, but we also know that there's some bad news when it comes to education in our state. I touched on this earlier, but we know that Minnesota has among the state's largest gaps, and here's just a little bit digging one step deeper on that third grade reading measure that we talked about earlier, showing that American Indians, Black students, Hispanic students, the proportion meeting state standards among those groups is only half that of non-Hispanic white third graders. And there's a big gap between Asians and white students as well on this measure. So we have some pretty troubling gaps here starting early in life, as I mentioned a minute ago. Finally, another thing that we think we know about education in our state is that the future economy of Minnesota will depend even more heavily on a highly educated workforce. Some of you might recognize that this is actually a snippet taken from a publication put out by Georgetown University Center on Education about a year and a half ago. There have been some other numbers that have been put out around this, but the point here is the one on the bottom, that Minnesota ranks 3rd in post-secondary education intensity. That meaning that we're likely to have a high growth in jobs that require a lot of education. And so those are some of the basics that we know about education in Minnesota. Now we want to dig deeper and find out what's going on with education among millennials. So I'm going to ask a question of Jane, but first I'll ask it of you. So pick up your keypads again. Where does Minnesota rank in educational attainment, those attaining BA or higher, among those age 25 to 34, those early career millennials?
All right, well, we're seeing about half of you believe that we're similar to the state overall. And in fact, we are number 7. So about over a third of our millennial population has a BA or higher, which is a really great figure for us. It tells us a lot about, as Craig mentioned, that strength of our educational system for the state. I'll have you know, too, in case folks are wondering about the Twin Cities metropolitan region, that we're number 5 among metros. So we're right behind places like New York, Boston, and San Francisco for our share of young adults who have a bachelor's degree or higher. So while we certainly aren't sinking for our young adults and educational attainment, we do have some major leaks that need to be addressed. As Craig mentioned about our racial and ethnic gaps for attainment. And when we look for young adults, we see here this is a pretty wide spectrum statewide of what share of the young adult population by race has that bachelor's degree or higher. I'll point out that while we do fairly well for our Asian and white young adults, For many of our populations of color, fewer than 1 in 5 have a bachelor's degree or higher. And when we compare it against the nation, so kind of looking at nationwide, our white non-Hispanic population does better than our national figures, but for all of the other race groups, we lag behind the national figures. We'll look too at high school graduation, and one of the reasons that we want to look at high school graduation is that we're seeing a decade of on-time graduation rates here by white and of color, and that entire decade are made up of millennials. So the people that are represented in these lines are all millennials from 2003 to 2012. It's really kind of the picture of what's happened in the last decade. And we've seen that the gaps are very large. So in 2003, we're looking at 36 percentage points. And here's the bright light that we can look at for high school graduation. By 2012, we have a narrowing of the gap to 27 percentage points. And we wish we were going faster, and we wish we were much narrower than what it is right now. But we are seeing that there was a 14 percentage point increase in the on-time graduation rates for students of color for our millennials. So Craig, that's what we have to say about millennials in education. Where does that lead us next?
Well, I'm a little slow. I'm a Generation Xer, so let me make sure that I caught up with you here. It sounds.
We go fast, us more.
If I followed you right, Jane, it sounds like that the millennials are actually ranking pretty highly. We're doing pretty well with education overall. We still have these troubling gaps, but there is some good news. The gaps are narrowing. Did I get it?
Yeah, especially gaps in high school on-time graduation rates. And since I'm a millennial, and all millennials tweet, right? We all use Twitter. So if I were tweeting this, which maybe you guys can type this quickly, I would say that Minnesota educational attainment, we are competitive overall, you're right, Craig, but we've got troubling racial gaps that need to change and see progress like we see in high school graduation.
Great, okay, so that was a look at education both for the state as a whole and for the millennial generation. Let's move on to a closely related topic and look at the economy and specifically at employment in our state. So I'll again provide the broad overview here. What do we know about employment in Minnesota as a whole? Well, we know that Minnesota has the highest employment rate in the nation. Almost. We do have our partners here from North Dakota Compass, so at the last minute we had to add that in. Also, we do have our partners from South Dakota as well, and we're basically tied with South Dakota. So let's something about this tri-state region that the Bush Foundation covers that we're doing pretty well with employment. That said, just like we saw with education, there are some troubling gaps with employment. Many people in this crowd probably know that whereas we lead the nation overall, and when we compare whites, non-Hispanic whites in Minnesota to non-Hispanic whites elsewhere in the country, we also rank highly there, 4th overall. But when we get down to some other racial and ethnic groups, we don't rank so highly. African Americans ranking in Minnesota compared to African Americans elsewhere in the country, ranking 32nd. American Indians, 45th. Asian employment in Minnesota compared to employment elsewhere, ranking 34th. So some pretty serious gaps. Earlier we talked about education, now we're talking about the proportion employed. What else do we know about employment? Well, now we're starting to talk here about the millennials. The recession, of course, we all know that people had a hard time, a lot of people had a hard time with the recession. This slide actually shows a dozen years worth of looking at the employment rate, the proportion of adults that had paid employment over the past dozen years. What we're seeing on the slide is that overall, over the course of that dozen years, Minnesota as a whole lost about 3 percentage points when it comes to the proportion working. But if you look at that orange line, that's the 20 to 24-year-olds, they slipped about 4 percentage points in the proportion who are working. And so that's a pretty serious fall. 4 percentage points maybe doesn't sound dramatic, but if you don't have a job, it feels very dramatic. The purple line there is the teenagers, 16 to 19, and they really took a hit. over the recession. I think the percentage point gap there was something closer to 13 percentage points. 13 percentage points were lost over the course of those dozen years. So a pretty rough time to be entering the workforce. But that's all I know about employment in Minnesota. So I have another question for Jane and another question for all of you that you've been thinking about. So millennials are less likely to be employed than were previous generations when they entered the workforce. Do we think that's true, or is that false?
Or does it depend? Well, if a researcher tells you it depends or gives you the option it depends, take it. I'll tell you that. No. When we look at these figures, it's really interesting. We'll look first at it overall, and then we'll break it out a little bit by age and gender. So first, let's look at the proportion of adults working from 1980 to 2012. We're going to look just at those 16 to 34-year-olds, so kind of entry level and early career. And you can see that it really hasn't changed much when you look at it overall. About 71% when boomers were entering, and about 72% for the millennials. Gen Xers a little bit higher, and in the 2000s it was in the middle, but really not that big of a change. However, when we look at it by early career and entry level, that's where we see the more interesting trend. For early career, when we look at our female population, 25 to 34, from 1980 to 1990, we can see kind of the end of this tail end movement of women into the workforce. When you look at 1970, it's much lower, and then we see it increasing and becoming really pretty steady from 1990 to 2012. This is one of our more steady shares that we'll look at. For males, we can see that there's been a slight but steady decline since 1980. So comparing boomers to Xers and millennials, this tells us that, as a female, you're probably much more likely to be working than boomers, but about the same as Gen Xers. We see a lot of change for entry-level folks. So as Craig mentioned, that 16 to 24 age group is really where we're seeing a lot of change, especially if you're male. Here's the line for males. 2/3 of males in the baby boomer and Gen Xers and in 2000 were working. That's 66% figure of those entry-level males. But by 2012, we see that drop to about 57%. For females, the trend is a little bit different. We see a bit of an increase through to 2000 and then another decline from 2000 to 2012. Now, some of this might be school enrollment, because we did also see that enrollment for this age group did go up slightly, or quite a bit, I should say, but even if you have any paid level of work, so 5 hours, you're still included in these numbers. So this tells us that we're really looking at a different picture economically for the previous generations and for millennials, especially when we're talking about entry level. This doesn't speak to the quality of the job that you might have, the number of hours that you're working, or your pay. So those are all things to consider as well. When we look at income, compared 1980 to today, we see that overall, when you look at median household income overall, we've seen a pretty significant increase. So when you adjust for inflation, it's actually about an 18% increase. So that's pretty good overall. But when we break it down by age, we see a really different story. So here's the median income by age in 1980. It goes up as you get further into your career, pretty much what we would expect. When we look at it for 2012, we see that the income gains, or there's actually been income loss from 16 to 19, and again, 20 to 24 of about 20%. And then when we look at the rest of the age spectrum, the majority of those gains that we see when we look at it overall, that 18% figure, is really explained quite a bit by the increase in the boomer age group and up. So for those of you who are in that age group, you're doing better than people who were your age in 1980. Whereas if you're 16 to 24, you're doing worse. You're having a lower median income than were the people who were your age in 1980. The last thing that we'll look at is poverty, as it relates, of course, to income and employment. So for these entry-level and early career adults, we see from about 1980 to 2000 a steady, if not declining, rate of poverty for these folks. But from 2000 to 2012, we see really significant jumps in the shares of these entry-level and early career adults who are in poverty, as high as 18% for 16 to 24-year-olds and 12% for 25 to 34. These are really critical years as you enter your workforce, as you try and create your career for yourself. So I think these are definitely numbers to be concerned about when we say, how is it compared to what it's been before?
All right, great. Again, a lot of numbers there. Let me see if I kept up with you on that one. So it sounds like millennials are entering the workforce at a particularly tough time, but that when you take the historical perspective, there's kind of a mixed picture. Women are better off, men not so much. But that the real dramatic difference is when it comes to looking at income when we're comparing millennials to previous generation. Did I get it?
Gosh, Craig, you'd think we'd practice this or something. You did get it. Here we go with our tweet. So in employment and income, we're looking at millennials are entering the workforce in the tougher time, but pay and poverty are really just plain worse compared to boomers and Xers.
Okay, so finally, let's. So there was some kind of hard news to take when it came to especially looking at those poverty rates. So usually there's a ray of sunlight when we look at civic engagement. So again, let's take a look at how things are going for Minnesota as a state as a whole. Quick review here. Minnesota has among the nation's highest rates of both voting and volunteering, actually #1 in voting. So we're doing great here. The question is how with Minnesota changing, how are those millennials doing? And we have some work to do here, it looks like, Jane. Millennials are the Minnesotans least likely to vote, it looks like. When it comes to volunteering, millennials are the Minnesotans least likely to volunteer. Okay, so we have raised some concerns here, so let's ask a question. Millennials are carrying on Minnesota's tradition of nation-leading civic engagement. What do all of you think about that question?
Ta-da. Oh, 42% agree, 39% disagree. You guys can go fight it out in the back. And then we've got some tail ends that strongly agree or disagree. And I just heard somebody say in the audience, relative to what? And that was a woman after my own heart. Because I'll tell you what, I'm feeling pretty beat up about the millennial engagement and basically being called a slacker. That, you know, we're the least likely to vote and the least likely to volunteer. But relative to national figures for our same age groups, actually, Minnesota millennials do pretty darn well. And I think it's something that a strength we can work from. Definitely, we should vote more and volunteer more. However, we are #2 for voter turnout among states, and we're #6 for volunteering among states. So while boomers might be strong and Xers are good looking, I would say millennials are above average. I think the other important thing to point out is that when we're talking about civic engagement and we're looking at voting and voter turnout, we're really talking about two very formalized ways to engage civically. And there is a whole spectrum of engagement that doesn't quite fit into those boxes, right? So we know that the many ways that we engage in our community maybe don't always fit that exact box of voter turnout or volunteering. And that's one reason that I am really looking forward to hear Trista Harris's conversation about engaging millennials and what that can look like beyond those two boxes.
Okay, so I'm here to make an apology to all of you millennials. I guess that you are indeed carrying on Minnesota's nation-leading trend there. And I will point out that I did actually look it up, and you millennials who voted for the first time in the recent Obama elections, you actually had a stronger turnout than we did, Generation Xers. You got to give us Generation Xers a little bit of a break. My first election that I voted in was the Bush versus Dukakis. I can't imagine why we weren't so inspired to come out, but anyways, I'm glad to see that there is indeed a high level of civic engagement, and that we'll be hearing more about that from Trista. How would you might put that in a tweet, Jane?
If I were to tweet this, I would say that really our engagement isn't quite lacking. We're nationwide, or #2 nationwide for voting, #6 for volunteering, and we've got a lot more to hear about it from Trista.
Great. So I'm going to kind of wrap things up on this section of the program. Just a reminder that Minnesota does indeed look like this, and that Minnesota does indeed look like this, but that Minnesota certainly also looks like this, and that the millennial generation, hopefully we've made the case it's an important generation to pay attention to and plays an extremely important role in the future of our state. If you remember this slide that we put up early in the show, I'll give you a little additional information, and that is that if we look at today's workforce, right now about 29% of today's workforce is made up of millennials. When we go out and we see that there are far fewer workers per retirement-aged adults 20 years from now, it's also the case that a higher proportion of that workforce will be made up of millennials. So a very important part of our demography, and our future prosperity here. And I think I've also learned that I should get on board and communicate like all you young whippersnappers do. So let me take a stab at it in case we feel neglected. Millennials have been in the spotlight today, but we'll need all of us to come on board. So here, I'll see if that shows up on this tweet wall in just a minute. And before I go, I think it's particularly important to do a selfie thing. Okay, I think I got that. So thank you very much for bearing with me through the presentation.